wiring off the stand, next thing you need, or off the engine, next thing you need to do is we need to start freshening up the motor. And a lot of people might be like, oh, well, it said it was running when it was pulled. A lot of these motors are sitting for a long time. A lot of these motors, they need some work. So at a minimum, you need to go through and just do like a fresh up on the motor. I would suggest that if you have the time and the means and the money, is I would pull the head off and I would take it off to get it machined, use ARP head studs and get a new head gasket just to have, you know, the full insurance. I ended up doing that down the road, and it ended up doing it while the motor was inside the car, but you should still maybe look at something like that getting done. But the top things that you need to make sure you're getting done is you need to new timing belt, new water pump, front seal, rear seal, oil pump fresh up seal kit, new valve cover gasket, go through and get a new intake manifold gasket, a new exhaust manifold gasket, and another thing you're probably going to need, unless you choose to use the factory downpipe, is you're going to need a new exhaust downpipe gasket and a new custom exhaust downpipe. Those are some of the basics that you'll need to get this freshen up done and get the car ready to go. As you can see, I'll flip to a picture. That's what I did with this motor to get it ready to drop into the car. And those are just the basics to get the motor ready. Now, as far as other items that you're going to need for this build, is you're going to need a clutch, and what you're going to need is you're going to need a hybrid clutch setup. So you're going to need a 5S FE clutch disc, but you're going to need a 3S GTE pressure plate, as well as you're also going to need a 3S GTE flywheel. And then a lot of people, they'll get these hybrid clutch kits. I would right away take the throw-out bearing that's inside that kit, throw it away. Buy either an OEM throw-out bearing for a 5S FE, or buy, I believe this other one that's a really good one is Timken. Use that brand as well. But that's what you need for your clutch setup to get that ready. Now, as far as transmission, you can use either the 5S FE, the S54 transmission, which comes in these cars. I highly recommend that if you have that transmission, use that transmission. It's probably the easiest to make this swap work. Bolts right into the car. But I know a lot of other guys will grab the E153. I believe the one that works the best for this car is the one that's found in the Toyota Solara, manual Toyota Solara. Very, very hard to find. You're going to need to do a lot of work with it though, because I believe the rear motor mount, you're going to have to some way fabricate a way of creating a new rear motor mount. So that one's a little bit more work, but the one thing that's great about that is that I believe that transmission is rated for around 500-600 horsepower, while the S54, you're on the ragged edge at 400 horsepower. And the axles for the S54, I heard that if you launch this car and you launch it with more than 300 horsepower, after a while you're going to snap those axles. So that's on the transmission side. Now, if you also, what you're going to need, I already talked about the wiring, but another good thing that you're also going to need, you're going to need an intercooler. Intercooler piping. What I did is I went with the 2.5-inch piping. Some guys say you can get away with 2-inch. I went with 2.5. Seems to make the throttle response just right. Front mount intercooler, that's what I'm running here. I'm actually just running some simple eBay CX Racing generic intercooler that I got online. I used to run a water to air intercooler setup. Very, very difficult to set up, very, very hard to work with, and they heat soak pretty easily. It kept the engine temps a lot cooler, but again, when you really got on it, that intercooler would heat soak and you would lose all the benefits of the cooling. So that's why I went back with a air-to-air intercooler setup. And if you look at my air-to-air intercooler setup, a lot of guys run it this way. You can run it a different way, but what I ended up doing is, okay, here's where the turbo is. Comes out of the turbo. I end up using some heat wrap because it's going right over the exhaust manifold. Comes right down, shoots down, and then it hits the intercooler. Comes all the way across the intercooler, and then it comes up through here, pops up right here, and then comes up through a blow-off valve, and then right into the intake. Very, very simple. And then what I ended up doing is I ended up taking some other intercooler piping and fabbing up and creating a intake manifold. Also too, what's a good idea to actually put on these cars, this is a good idea also too to get a catch can. A lot of guys will take this right here, which is your breather coming off of your valve cover, and they will route it directly back into the intake. That is an option to do if you want to, but you're gonna start getting a lot of oil in your intercooler. So what I end up doing is I end up running it to a catch can, from the catch can to the intake, so I keep a vacuum on the system, make sure I don't have any seals blowing out. Other thing is this one right here. This is for my idle air control valve. It comes down to way down in there where you see that clamp down in there. You can just put a breather down there and not have it connected here. The only problem you're gonna run into if you do something like that is you're gonna have this loud sucking noise at idle, and it can get pretty loud and pretty annoying. Other optional items that you can have for this build, but are pretty recommended, is a gauge setup. I would recommend at a minimum having a boost and an AFR gauge so that you can make sure that your air-fuel ratios are in check, and then you also need to make sure that your boost is in check as well. Now, the one thing from the factory, without a boost controller, these engines will only run, depending on your elevation, anywhere from 7 to 9 PSI, which will put you right in the 180, 190 horsepower range. From there, you need some type of boost controller, which is also, I mean, optional if you want to do it or not, to turn up the boost. I would recommend, to be safe, if you do decide to go a boost controller route, manual, electronic, whatever you choose, unless you have access to 93 octane, I wouldn't turn it up past no more than about 14 PSI. And then even if you get to 93 octane, 17 PSI is about the limit. And a lot of guys will use octane boosters to kind of push it, but some of these octane boosters are good, some of them are just gimmicks, so it's completely up to you. But at a good 14 PSI, no more than 14 PSI, will keep your motor safe. When I dynoed my motor for the first time at Hammer Performance on 14 PSI, I pulled around 240 horsepower to the wheels. So you're doing pretty good there. And this is on the factory ECU, because remember, this setup with this wiring is going to allow you to run the factory ECU that comes with this motor, which is another thing you need to make sure is included with the motor, is the factory ECU. So let's take a little bit more of a look at my setup. As you can see, coil unplug. There is a factory PCV system built into this motor. I would recommend maintaining it. If you don't want to, you can plug this in or turn it to a breather, and you can plug that in. Here's the factory map sensor, which you'll be using unless you go aftermarket. This is one of the things you also need to check to make sure is not broken, because those things will cost about $200 if you have to buy one by itself. Down here, got the alternator. I used to run the 3S alternator, but it decided to die on me, and to get a new one of those, again, $250, $300. This is just a AutoZone 5S FE alternator, and the only thing you have to do to make it work is you have to drill out this this bottom hole, because it's threaded, and then it bolts right into place just like the 3S one. Now make sure you get the high output one, the 90 watt one, not the 70 watt one, because you're going to need that extra voltage or extra wattage in order to drive your coil on plug setup. So Optima Battery, already showed you guys the intake. A lot of guys, what they'll do, because the factory intake sits right here, is they'll run a pipe down in here, which will take you down in front of the bumper here, and get a cooler air charge. I don't see it as much of a big deal, because since it is running through an intercooler, there's not much of a problem there. Got the starter mounted down in there. Now I ended up running Aftermarket Fans. So I've got a Mishimoto high flow fan and a race fan. I would have put 2 race fans, but the race fan wouldn't fit over there. And a thin radiator shroud and a coil radiator. I would definitely suggest, especially if you're in hotter climates like me, I'm in New Mexico where it gets into the hundreds over the summer, that you do an upgraded radiator setup, whether it be a coil or whatever you can think of, in order to keep the engine cool. When I tried to run just the factory radiator, my car would run hot, especially when I got on it.
but pretty much everything else stays about factory with this car.
So you've done all the basics. You've got all the basics, everything you need, engine's ready to go in the car, you've gotten your wiring harness back from one of the people who are doing the wiring for you. And so the first thing you need to do, take the engine off the engine stand, mate it with the transmission. Make sure that you've got your clutch and everything lined up properly. Use a clutch alignment tool, line it up properly, and then mate the clutch or the transmission with the engine. And then from there, in reverse order, you're gonna take and you're gonna slide it right back into the car. It'll hook under, you'll catch that motor mount over there, then you'll catch the motor mount over here, and then you'll have to play with it and jiggle it around to get the front and the rears to finally hook in. After that, it's a matter of just connecting up hoses, connecting up wiring, filling it up with oil, and getting it going.